Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the Developing the Rumen for Optimum Calf Health this afternoon. I'm Emily Collins, Knowledge Exchange Manager at AHDB Dairy, and I'm very glad to be joined by Ginny Sherwin, who's the Clinical Assistant Professor at Nottingham University. So today we're going to be covering mainly the importance of pre-weaning calf management for optimal rumen development in kind of that optimal weaning on your farm, post-weaning nutrition considerations, and how to monitor and measure weaning performance targets. So that's going to be the main focus of today. Just run through a little bit of housekeeping. So if you haven't joined a webinar before, everyone's muted. Please do ask questions throughout the webinar. We've got sections allocated to answer questions, so we won't be leaving them all to the end, so do ask away. And all questions are anonymous, so there's no silly questions. And if you're registered for Dairy Pro, please enter your name, email address and postcode, and we'll get those points allocated to you. We should be finished up around 1:45. So that's that, and we'll jump straight in with Ginny. So thank you very much for joining us. We'll get started. Oh, sorry, nearly missed. So we've got this webinar as a bit of a kickstart to this weaning management campaign, and then we've got some regional meetings. So we've got them, well, up until the end of the year. Have a look through. Please keep an eye on either the events email that you should receive, if not the events page online. Got some meetings coming up. They'll be delivered by local vets or young stock consultants, and Ginny is doing a few for us as well, so keep an eye out for those. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Well, thank you everybody for coming. Hopefully this meeting will be what you want from it. So just a kind of outline of this webinar, these are the types of questions that I'm going to try and answer before 1:45 today. I appreciate the questions on here might not be all the questions that you've come to the webinar wanting to know the answer to. That's fine. This is meant to be complementary to the roadshows that Emily's just talked to you about. So hopefully we'll answer some of them, but also hopefully it'll encourage you to come and join us on the roadshows, which should be good fun. So from my point of view, when we think about rearing calves, we've always traditionally thought about, we want the calves to live, you know, that's really important. We also don't want them to suffer from any diseases. So we don't want any scour, pneumonia, but we also want them to grow at our target growth rate, and we want that to happen in an economical manner. I would really like to add another objective to kind of...
Oh, Ginny, you've just gone a little bit robotic. I'm just going to, whilst we wait for Ginny, we're going to pull these up a little bit later. But I'll start with a poll. This is a little bit early on, but we'll just do this. So everyone, if you'd like to answer this question, we're going to be talking about this a little bit later on. But one of the questions we wanted to ask and see kind of who's listening and what you're doing on farm is, when do you offer your calves starter feed from? Is it from birth, from 2 to 3 weeks of age, 2 to 3 weeks prior to weaning, or at the point of weaning? So if we just get a few responses from that whilst we wait for Ginny to come back. All right, I'll just close that poll. So we had 69% of people giving starter feed from birth, which I think Ginny would be pleased about, and then about 31% from 2 to 3 weeks of age. So that's just a bit of a comparison for what people are doing, majority from birth. I think whilst we're still waiting for Ginny, we will do the other poll. Where were we? And then we were going to cover a little bit of grazing conversation later on. So that is a poll on that, which is approximately how often do you rotate the paddocks that heifers are grazing on? Is that every few days, every 2 to 3 weeks, every 6 to 8 weeks, or never they are set stocked? Give you a few moments to respond to that. Apologies, might have could have put an option in there if you're not grazing at all. And those are the results. So bit more variation there. So 32% every few days, 32% every 2 to 3 weeks, 21 every 6 to 8 weeks, and a few people 16% still set stocking. Yeah,
so
can you hear me?
I'm really sorry, my laptop clearly objects to heat and is acting like a heat-stressed cow and giving up on life. So going back a slide as to rearing dairy calves, it's really important for us to think about that rumen function. That rumen needs to develop, and it's not going to be fully functional until it's at least 6 months of age, the calf, and it's not going to reach that adult capacity until the animal's about 13 months of age. So why do we care about rumen development? We really do care, because if we think of our neonates, they're dependent on one energy source, milk. It's a very high lactose-based diet, and it's digested in the abomasum. That really differs for when we think of our 6 months old animals, where we want our young stock to be able to digest a complex diet, lots of different types and sources of food, and we need it to go into the rumen. So we need that rumen, which is essentially a highly adaptive fermentation vat, which digests cellulose, to be going and actually working really well. And what I really like to remember here is that actually adult cows spend 10 to 12 hours a day ruminating. So that's 50% of their life. So we really need to get our job right here in order for us to utilise the amount of energy later on. So if we then think about how do calves get energy out of the solid feed, so they're going to eat quite a large complex molecule, and that's the starch, and that's what's indicated here over on the left. We then need what we call the microbiome. So this is bacteria, protozoa, fungi, and they're going to break it down into smaller energy units called volatile fatty acids. And these get absorbed by the rumen wall. Now, volatile fatty acids can be used as energy sources themselves. So you might be used to measuring one in adult cows, BHBs, beta-hydroxybutyrate, but the use of volatile fatty acids as direct energy sources is only okay. It doesn't release all the energy potential that's there, so it can be quite wasteful. So actually what we really want is a volatile fatty acids to enter the bloodstream, go to the liver, where it can then become glucose, and we get the maximum amount of energy out of that molecule. So we now need to think about how are we going to get calves to get this solid feed going in for us to maximise this. So if we first think of a beef suckler system, and when calves naturally start to eat solid feed, and you look at the extensively reared beef calves, these have been reported to start grazing slowly, so picking at grass for short periods of time, 10-15 minutes in the first few weeks of life, with grazing time increasing linearly from about 20 minutes at 10 days of age to about 3 hours by the time they're 3 months of age, so about 70% of the adult grazing time. Why it's important to think about this is actually eating solid feed is a learnt response. It's not a reflex like the suckle reflex. If you think of when you wean a human child, it goes in their mouths, it goes on the floor, it goes in the dog, they spit it out. It's exactly the same with calves. They've got to learn to eat it. It's new, it feels weird, it smells funny. You know, they like to do things together. And learning about novel feeds, which starter is, and forage, it's basically a process of sampling available different food types and developing associations with them. So we can get some really nice positive ones, but we can also get negative ones if the feed's mouldy, for instance. And that's why it's really important for us to start to think about how we present calves with feed, as it's going to influence how likely they are to eat it. My favourite example of this is the little blue buckets we get on farm. These are great for water, not so great for solid feed. If it's been in there a while, you scrape the top layer off, and underneath it's like Weetabix. I don't want to put my hand in there, nor is your calf going to want to stick its nose in there. So we need to think about these things. So once our calf has then started eating the feed, we need bugs to break it down. That's great, but a calf is born sterile, so we need it to get a microbiome from somewhere. So we will get a little bit coming from a calf suckling, whether that's from the dam or artificial in the colostrum, milk, water. But remember, these are diverted into the abomasum. most of it through the esophageal groove. So actually the vast majority of it is going to come from the environment. And again, I like to think of calves as dirty little toddlers. They go around licking everything, each other, the walls, the gates, normally the latch of the gate so they can escape. And also later on, it's going to come from the solid feed that they eat. And it's really important that we develop a balanced microbiome, because that's what's going to be key for us efficiently utilising forages later on in life. Great, so we've now got a rumen that's got a microbiome establishing, and we're also sticking in our starch so we can break it down to volatile fatty acids. So now we need to just absorb it across the rumen wall. For that, we need papillae, and they're like finger-like projections, and they create a massive surface area for absorption. If you look at an adult rumen and you open up their rumen, it looks like a carpet because it's just packed dense of these papillae. Calves, on the other hand, are born without papillae, so they can't absorb these volatile fatty acids that are sat in the rumen. So what we need is for the papillae to grow, and this growth is stimulated by the presence of volatile fatty acids. So it's quite a clever process that the end product is what stimulates our ability to absorb. So what we've got so far is we've taught our calf how to eat concentrates. It's managed to acquire the right bugs to break it down. We get the volatile fatty acids, and that gets absorbed across the papillae. Perfect. One issue, if we run a heavy starch diet, we're going to have a lot of acid sitting around in that rumen. And we know that the rumen pH likes to sit around 6. However, lots of volatile fatty acids is going to make it lower. And that runs the risk of us dropping below 6 and getting subacute ruminal acidosis or acute ruminal acidosis. And it'll also kill off some of our microbiome. So when we think about how are we going to stop this, we think about forage. We need calves to have forage in their diet. That's really important. It's going to stimulate that cutting action, and with that we get increased saliva production. Whilst calf saliva isn't as good at buffering as adult saliva, it still does help, and it helps to balance that pH. The other role we've got is that in a neonate, the rumen is tiny. It's a piddly little thing. It's non-functional. It's the abomasum that takes up nearly 50% of those forestomachs. But actually, when we get to an adult, we want that rumen to be at least 2/3 of the forestomachs. So we need to increase the capacity of the rumen, and with that, we need to develop the rumen wall so we can actually start to get this active rumination and churning. So we talk about forage acting as a bulking agent because it helps stretch. So you can see in this 12 weeks, we've gone from 38% to over 60%. And actually, the other thing to say is the abomasum doesn't shrink. It's just in comparison, it looks a lot smaller. So we really need to increase that rumen capacity. The last thing is parakeratosis. So it prevents parakeratosis. Without fibre, we get a development on the papillae of a hardened keratin layer, which is my dodgily drawn purple cells along here. And basically, that keratin layer acts as a physical barrier. So we can't absorb our energy in the form of volatile fatty acids. Also reduces the blood flow to papillae, so we're escorting less of it out, and it reduces our rumen motility. So we then end up with a buildup of volatile fatty acids that exceeds our capacity of the rumen, lowering the rumen pH. We're going to start to see calves with poor growth rates, poor feed conversion efficiency, and loose feces. So what we do is we add fibre, and again, apologies for my drawings, but basically what we're after here is what we call scratch factor. It effectively just removes those dead cells so we can still absorb it. And I always think of it as a bit of a toothpick coming in and flicking it off. So it's really important from that point of view. So the reason I wanted to talk to you about rumen development is because obviously when we think about weaning, we're going to think about switching from milk to solid feed. And actually we need to think about how we're going to get our energy out of our solid feed, but also what's our solid feed doing to our calf. This is a little summary of all the things I've quickly whizzed you through. The key thing is this takes time to develop, and it actually takes about 3 to 4 weeks before we start to get energy out of this solid feed. And that's 3 to 4 weeks from it being offered, not from birth. So it's all to do with when you offer it. And I think it was at this point we were going to have some questions, Emily.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
I can't hear you, Emily, hold on.
Might be your speakers, I think.
Yes. There we go, I can now, sorry.
You can hear me. Lovely, fantastic. So whilst we were waiting for you, Ginny, we did a couple of the polls. So just I know we were going to pull up when do you start offering your calves starter feed, and we had 69% people say from birth and 31% people from 2 to 3 weeks of age, and no one after 3 weeks, or 2 weeks before weaning or at the point of weaning. So I didn't know if you wanted to touch on that.
Yeah, I think for me it's really an important thing to think about in terms of getting the energy out of it. For me, from birth, it doesn't need to be a lot, a little handful. Again, thinking about how we offer it, I actually quite like shallow aluminium dog bowls. They fit in the same hoops as the blue buckets, and it's nice and shallow and open, just a handful. We just want to get them starting to play with it, so that actually by the time they get to 4 weeks of age, they're starting to build up, eating a few hundred grams, and then we're getting the energy from it. The longer you delay it, the longer it takes for us to get energy out of that starter, and it's then not contributing. And we'll talk about why we want that to contribute to our energy in the next section.
Thank you. And we've got a question: what is the best form of starter feed, pellets or muesli or other?
So if you look in the literature, there are hundreds of papers on this. Theoretically, with the muesli, you can get sorting, and also you might not get as efficient enzymatic digestion. But for me, actually, I'm less bothered about which one you offer it. For me, it's all about how you offer it. Have you got enough feed space? How much are your calves intaking? How are you offering water? Because it's very dry. So theoretically, if you made me choose, I'd probably go for a pellet. But equally, if you fed muesli, if I walked onto your farm, it wouldn't be something I would make you change, providing it's presented in a nice manner to the calf.
All right, thank you. And then another one on from that, when is it best to offer the starter, e.g. Straight after milk drinking or just any time of day?
Any time of day. For me, I'd have it ad lib. It's there. Calves need to be able to go and play. They're curious little creatures. It's going to take them a while to walk up and stick their nose in the trough, the bucket. So for me, I'd just have it ad lib in a corner. Just make sure it doesn't go mushy and horrible.
Thank you. And then maybe last one on this section. Is it true that your heifers, if they're going into a housed herd on TMR, they should have that diet from calves, and if they're going into a grazing herd, they need to graze? Or that's quite a big one.
Okay, so we are going to cover this definitely coming up. Can we come back to that question, Emily, in case I've not answered it? But I'm hoping the next bits, I'm going to cover some grazing and I'm going to cover some diets going into post-weaning. So hopefully that will get covered coming up.
Perfect, thank you. And continue sending in your questions. Thank you, Ginny.
Perfect, right. Okay, so from my point of view, why does getting it right matter? So for me, there's 3 fundamental things. We need to think about the welfare of these animals. In terms of, if I suddenly took away from you over the period of a few ways your lunch and dinner in a day, you get quite distressed by this, as will a calf. And personally, by lunchtime, I'd be really angry if you started to take meals or snacks away from me. The other thing is they are going to struggle if we don't get this right, and we are going to see an increase in disease. So especially we often think about respiratory disease being the problem. Production wise, we've all talked about growth checks, it's something we talk about, but actually you will see this on farm, and it can have quite a long hangover effect. So we need to be thinking about almost long term as well. And obviously there are financial consequences of having sick, underperforming calves, especially with it impacting how the calves perform in the next phase. And hopefully the next few slides, I'll talk to you about why the next phase of growth is really important from an economics point of view, and kind of getting that growth. So traditionally we like to think they're big enough, ugly enough and old enough to get on with it, weaned calves, but actually for me these are our princesses of our herd. This is your herd in the next 2 years, and these are the ones we can really, we should be paying a lot more attention to. Why? If we think about our ultimate goal with heifers, we want to calve them at 22 to 24 months of age, but actually the important bit of this is we want them to be 85 to 90% of adult body weight. So if we think of a Holstein heifer, we're talking of gaining around 550 kilos in the space of 670 days. What would be ace is if we could grow them at a nice linear fashion from birth to calving. Makes it simple. That would be fine, apart from one of the reasons not to is we get this change in feed conversion efficiency. So if we look at this third column here, you can see that actually for our pre-weans, you stick 2 kilos of dry matter in, you get a kilo growth back. You know, they're effectively monogastrics. They act really nicely like pig and poultry. You can pile the weight on whilst you're relying on the milk. However, once we wean them and we start to use the rumen, you can see we're now in our wean calves 3 to 4 kilos to get our kilo growth. And actually, by the time we get to older heifers, you know, it's quite a lot that we're having to stick in dry matter wise, 8 to 15 kilos to get 1 kilo of growth back. So we need to be thinking about utilising this feed conversion efficiency to get the best growth. The other thing is, ultimately what also matters, especially at the moment with costs, how much is it costing you? So these are figures taken by Alana Bolton's work, but you can see the cost of the daily rearing, and I mean these are old now, especially given current climate, but there's a very wide range between how much it costs per day. But also that pre-wean calf phase is a lot more expensive, and ultimately that's the milk that costs that. So milk replaces now, you might be paying 2,200, the really top spec ones 2.5 grand a ton, concentrate 300 and 400 pounds a ton. So actually weaned calves where we've got 25-30% forage and 70% concentrate, actually that concentrate is 6 to 7 times cheaper than our milk. So actually let's be smart about it and let's try and get a lot of growth out of our cheaper feed substrate whilst we still have good feed conversion efficiency. However, the one thing I am going to say here is I am definitely not saying let's not grow calves well in the first 8 weeks of life on milk. That would be a really daft idea for so many reasons. You know, there's been so much work to show the impact of good nutrition in that pre-weaned life. You know, a great one is Alex Back's work that showed if you increase your daily live weight gain by 0.1 kilos a day in that first 2 months of life, you get an additional 226 kilos of milk in the first lactation, and it explained 5% of variation in future milk production. So we really aren't going to scrimp at this point. So I'm definitely not saying go home and, you know, go and knock off your milk feeding, definitely not. However, if we look at our older heifers around serving and pregnancy, the feed conversion efficiency is a lot worse. So we're having to put a lot more in to get that growth. And I'll show you later on that actually if you try and get compensatory growth later on in life, it becomes quite expensive and quite hard to do. And actually, Alex Back in this review last year really highlights this idea quite nicely. And I appreciate if you don't like graphs, this graph might look a bit stressful, but I'll just quickly talk you through it. So if you look at the x-axis, that's just the age of calves in days. If we look at the blue line, that is the increasing body weight as time goes along, and you read the body weight off the left-hand y-axis. So this blue line is kind of where we want our target body weights to be. Our orange line is how much it's costing us in euros cumulatively across that time period to rear that heifer. Here, this grey line, here he's done it in grams per day, which is why it looks so big on this left y-axis, is his target growth rates. And the reason why he's got these stage target growth rates is because if we look down here, these grey bars, this is euros per kilogram of growth gained. And this is read here off this right axis. So what we can see is we want this to be cheap. We want to get a kilo of growth, but for the least amount of money expenditure. And if you look here, from that 60 days to kind of around 150, 180, so 6 months, it's pretty cheap. We only start to really ramp it up when we get to kind of about 10 months of age here at 315 days. And actually, once we get to 400 days plus, we're on a very similar level to what we were here down in that pre-weaning period. So again, it's trying to be clever. So that's why he said, right, epigenetically, you know, we're going to turn lots of different genes on by good growth. We're going to get future production here. Also, you know, baby calves have a lot to contend with. They can't cope with a large amount of stress. They also don't deal well with the cold. Let's grow these at 1 kilo a day. But let's really ramp it up to 1.2 whilst it's really cheap to get this growth. And then actually, as it starts to get more expensive to get the growth, let's drop it back down. By the time they're pregnant and serving, we're back to the traditional 0.8, and right at the end, in that last trimester of pregnancy where the heifer puts loads of energy into the fetus, we're going to really drop it down to just shy of 0.6 kilos a day, because we know that her energy is diverted into the fetus. So how are we going to achieve 1.2 kilos a day post-weaning? The answer is really, really good rumen development. And how do we know if we've achieved this rumen development? For me, there's two ways you're going to know. We need to know that we've got starter consumption. So for me, I want my heifers to be eating at least 1.5 kilos at the point of weaning. This will get discussed more in the roadshows, but it's really key. If they've got the capacity to take that and digest it, we know they've got their energy coming through. The other thing is very outcomes based. The only way if you're going to know it's going well is to measure the outcome, and that's your growth rates. So having a look at those growth rates. An example of really nice rumen development is taken here from a spring block calver. So these calves, they're fed 6 litres of a commercial milk replacer at 15% solids all the way through to the point of weaning, and we wean based on concentrate consumption. At 4 weeks of age, these heifers go from being fed twice a day to once a day, and this is this OAD here. And you can see we weigh them at that point, mostly because I get stressed about it. And this box here basically tells us what the middle 50% of calves are doing, with the line being that if we lined up the calves from the worst to the best, this is our middle, our median calf. So our median daily live weight gain here is 0.5 kilos a day. Granted, it's January, February, so we have cold stress to contend with, but it's really not great. However, when you look at their daily live weight gain, pre-weaning will get 0.8. Why is that? Because actually, these guys offer concentrate from birth in really nice open troughs with plenty of feed space. We can see from 4 weeks to weaning that actually our median calf, this line here, is at about 0.95 kilos a day, and we have a decent chunk of calves flying at over 1 kilo a day. These are calves in February and March. It is not the warmest by the long shot. How has this happened? These guys have got really good rumen development, and they're getting high levels of starter intake in. So by the time these guys are weaned, these heifers will be eating 3 kilos plus at weaning, and they are growing like absolute stink, which means that actually when we get into that post-weaning phase, it's dead easy for them to match the 1.2. From an economics point of view, does feeding more starter make sense? So I've gone for a 7-week-old calf, so roughly around the point of weaning for most farms, about 75 kilos, and that's its energy requirements, just shy of 23.5 megajoules. If you look at how much it would cost you to feed 6 litres of milk at 15%, at £2,400 a tonne, and 1.5 kilos of concentrates at 350, you're at £2.68. But your theoretical daily live weight gain is 1.4 kilos a day. You know, these are going to be storming. And again, even if you decided I'm going to go high plain feeding at 8 litres of milk, it's much more expensive. So I think for me, it's are you being clever with where you're getting your feed out of? I am also going to reiterate now that I really don't want us to limit any growth in that pre-weaning stage. Why is that? Well, actually, if we look at how young stock grow, for me, this is the most important thing. We all get paranoid we're going to have heifers that are too small. Actually, 50% of our skeletal growth in heifers happens in that first 6 months of life. If you want a decent sized heifer, grow her in the first 6 months of life. It's not just the height that increases at this point. So there was some work done back in 2017, and this was looking at milk feeding, but it showed that if you fed 0.6 kilos a day compared to 1.3, your liver was much larger and heavier, as was the mammary gland, 2 really key organs for future production of heifers. And the other really interesting thing was different genes have been expressed within these tissues, which means they've activated different metabolic pathways, which means how they utilise energy differs. And this is what we think explains why heifers that grow really well in that pre-weaning phase actually go on to produce more milk, because we've activated different genes, we've given them that good start in life. So when we go back to Alex's graph, how are we going to do this, on farm? How are we going to achieve this non-linear growth? My caveat for this is an example. It is not going to be applicable to all units. And actually the reason it works on this unit is we do regular weight measurements. And if it's not going right, we will change it, we adapt. We change it for the next cohort coming through, but we also look ahead and see how much extra growth we need to get going forwards. We're still going for this idea of really nice daily live weight gain here. And we're probably pushing it here as to whether we get the 0.9. But we are looking for that, and that's for that increased production. But we are aiming for 1.2, 1.4 off concentrates and chopped straw to 6 months of age after weaning. And that really does need that rumen to be spot on. Why are we going that high? It means pretty much for the rest of the time we can cruise at 0.8 kilos a day. And for this farm, we then move them onto the grass-based TMR, which is cheaper for these guys than the concentrates. But we've also got the decreased feed conversion efficiency, so we don't need to hit the high targets. How are we doing? I think I've probably said this enough already, but we need to measure and monitor, measure and monitor. So for me, it can be daily live weight gain, so how much have you gained between 2 time points, or it can be done of have you hit a target have you hit a target at a certain time, Key thing is, I want multiple calves over plenty of time because I want a decent population to base our decisions on. I'm not going to be basing decisions on n equals 10, n equals 15 calves. Personally, the one thing I hate is averages. They really don't tell me a lot about what's going on your farm. And if you look at this graph over here on the left, the cross in the middle is the average for the growth for the calves 4 to 6 months of age. So it's just over a kilo. Again, this box is the middle 50% of calves. If you look here, there is a kilo difference in growth between that middle 50% of calves. Why? What is going on in this unit? It was not a nice uniform cohort. And we had some really big issues around feed presentation, how we were grouping and weaning on this farm. But if you told me you got an average of just over 1, you'd think you'd be doing pretty well. Similarly, I quite like the idea of looking at, have we hit a target? How many are overachieving, so above, and how many are below? So here we've got a lot of underachievers. And actually for me, how far have we got to catch up? So these ones down here that are around the 100 kilos, sorry, this x-axis is just an idea of calf. They've almost got to nearly double their body weight to hit that target. That's going to be massively expensive. And actually, maybe if we have the luxury of carrying more heifers than we need, this might be a moment to have some career decisions made. Because realistically, it's been suggested that we shouldn't deviate more than 2 standard deviations below that target before she either goes to beef or is culled, because she's just going to cost you more money to get to where you want to be, and you're always playing catch up, and that bad debtor that a heifer is just becomes worse and worse. So I think, Emily, that was my next break for if anybody had any questions.
Yeah, we've got a few, thank you. I think I'm just going to go back to the slide. Don't know if you've realised, Ginny, that I'm moving the slides on. I think.
Oh no, sorry.
No, it's all right. There was a slide with 3 growth sections on this one, so I just wanted to pull that up. We've got a question on what's the optimum weaning age?
So it's not age. It's really not age. So we used to talk about age and people would go anywhere from 5-6 weeks at the absolute minimum. But I really hope that I've explained to you that, I could get a calf to grow just on milk really nicely for 8 to 10 weeks if I gave them enough of it. They're not ready to be weaned. They haven't got a rumen. So for me, it really is, it's a no on age. I'm afraid it's all to do with concentrate intake, and it's not a thing of individual animals. I don't care about that. If you've got a group of 10 calves and you're putting a 20 kilo bag in every other day, you know that on average those calves are eating about a kilo a day. If you're having to put kind of 3 bags in every other day, you're getting closer. So actually as a mob, you need to know what that cohort's doing before you decide when you're going to wean. But for me, the absolute minimum is a kilo a head, ideally 1.5 kilos a head. So it's not age, I'm afraid.
All right, thank you. And then any thoughts on summer scour with weaned calves leading to serious weight loss?
So for me, I would go back to what are you feeding? How are you feeding? How are you weaning? What's your water look like? I think for me, it's very difficult. You know, summer scour is basically telling me you've got diarrhea in summer. It doesn't tell me, is it nutritional, is it infectious, what age, when, how we're doing it. So for me, it's a discussion to have with your vet, and it will probably involve them quizzing you a lot for a good history, because it's going to vary from farm to farm.
Right, thank you. And then just on this slide with the ages, are these growth rates on Holstein Friesians?
So this, I'm trying to remember. Oh, so you mean Alex Back's one with the 1.1, 1.2 one?
No, the height, 50% height increase and 25% weight gain for 0 to 6 months.
That's generic across breeds. It's not that your jerseys are going to grow 50% between 7 and 12 months. So breed will be irrelevant to this. Okay,
all right, thank you. Yeah, I guess as a follow on how do people, or how should you monitor growth in crossbreeds? I guess there's not as many kind of reference points compared to Holstein Friesians.
No, although Dairy NZ do some really nice stuff, as do AHDB. But ultimately, it's down to your farm. So we've said our target is to calve at 22 to 24 months. That is irrelevant of breed, and there was a research out of Liverpool looking at it in jerseys, and that is still the recommendation. So it doesn't matter breed there. You've then got to look at what is your adult body weight, and this is where, for me, quite a lot of the stuff here is generic, but you need to go back and look at yours. And when we say adult, we're looking at third lactation animals. What's the average weight of yours? You can then work it backwards, and you can look at your body weights as well. And crossbreeds, we deal a lot with a lot of spring block calvers, and we always have the debate as to what our targets are. Make it farm specific. I've got an example at the end of the presentation about the cost of catch-up, but that is an autumn block calver who does have all sorts of different varieties as we've changed the breeding over the kind of last 5+ years. So it's going back and looking at your farm and also setting realistic targets as well. It depends on what you want to do.
All right, thank you. We've got a couple of questions on weighing and how often. I think, were we going to cover?
We'll talk about how to weigh and when coming up.
Okay, lovely. Right, we'll
so you're moving my slides.
Continue. Yeah, thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Emily. Okay, so with that in mind, it's how do we achieve the daily live weight gain? Well, actually, we need to think about post-weaning. So we need to think about the digestive capacity, and I've probably bored you enough now with my love of rumen development and how important it is. So we've got all of that there. But we also need to think about what we put in front of the animals. And that's what's shown here in this green. We've got the physiochemical attributes, and we've also got what does it break down into, and does it make them feel full or not? And that I'm going to talk less about. The thing that we can focus on farm is really their physiochemical attributes, and all of these things then lead into how much voluntary feed intake your animal is going to be able to take, and influences how well they cope with the diet coming up. Just very quickly, as a slight tangent, as we're all sat here sweating and my computer's lost the will to live because it's too hot, temperature does have a massive impact on intakes. And it's really important to remember that actually at this time of year where we're hot, we are going to have a lot of decrease in terms of intakes. So sorry, Emily, if we could go to the next slide. I think there is, yeah, there we go, sorry. So we're going to get decreases, but remember in winter we're also going to have increases. So we need to think about that, especially think about that like a day to day. If you've got heifers out grazing, they're not going to be grazing right now. They're going to be trying to find somewhere to keep cool, whether that's stood by the water trough or whether that's under the shelter. So this is going to impact our intakes going forward. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. What are we going to feed them? So traditionally we've gone for whatever we've got, that will do. Quite often it's that, oh, this stuff's no good, we're going to feed it to the heifers. I'm really hoping by showing you that feed conversion efficiency for your R1s, so our young baby, young kind of post-weaning, that's not a sensible choice. You might get away with that in the pregnant heifers if you've grown them well for that first 15 months of life. So we actually really do need to think about what goes into these girls. So we've got these things in yellow, which is some of their practical aspects, which are completely fair enough, and I am not dismissing. What have we got and how much of it have we got? How long can we feed this for? And actually, has it been analysed? Do we know what's in it? Do we know how good it is? But actually, the thing that I want to focus on is the stuff in green. Where's the energy coming from? So is it still starch-based pellets, in which case we want that to be 70% of the diet, with 30% being forage. If we try and put too high a forage in, we're probably going to end up with a decreased overall dry matter intake. What protein supply have we got? Where's the protein coming from? Do the rumen microbes get it, or does it bypass? How efficiently can we utilise it for growth? Another thing to think about is avoiding moisture. Calves like really dry diets, which is great because it also decreases our spoilage rate. So we need to kind of also be looking a bit like we formulate for adult cows, we should also be formulating for heifers. Sorry, if we could go to the next slide, please. I really like this. This is from the AHDB feeding guide, and it's looking at example rations. So if we look at this one here, 3 months of age, we are looking at a cake and straw ration. Perfect. You'll notice that the grass silage doesn't come into 7 months age. Why is that? So grass silage can be really difficult to mix, so we can get quite good sorting and they won't eat it. It's really easy to spoil, which means they're not going to eat it anyway, and it often has a low dry matter. So, and also, sorry, the other thing with grass silage is it often has very little true protein because the majority of it gets degraded by the rumen microbes. So we're probably not going to get a lot in. There's not a lot of protein for them, and quite often they don't like eating it. The other thing is if it's poorer quality, then we get an increase of your NDF fibre. So that means they're going to eat less anyway because they can only eat 1% body weight of that. So again, we eat less, it's poor quality silage has got less energy in. So it really is a double hit. We're going to be not getting enough energy into these animals. So for me, it's kind of feeding silage not till 6 months of age. You'll also notice on here we don't have maize silage. Maize silage has a tendency to make them fat. So try and avoid that. The other thing to say is that another thing that we like to do is we like to feed an adult ration to heifers. I'll talk a little bit slightly more about it in a minute, but ideally we really want to avoid this if we can. We've got a mismatch of crude protein and energy. So it's too high energy and not enough crude protein. Most of your adult rations are going to sit at 16% crude protein. Our heifers want 18 to 20%, and the energy is too high. It's normally good 20-25% especially if it's a high yielding ration. So for me, the key things when we think about rations is let's not introduce grass silage to 6 months plus. And if we are going to do it, it needs to be decent stuff, and think about your bypass protein. Sorry, can we go back, Emily? I'm not ready for that slide. And so also make sure it's not spoiled. So if we're feeding leftovers, like today, leftovers are going to be grim. They're going to smell. It's going to have got really hot, especially if it's been out in the sun. So ideally, we're going to leave them on starter for 10 to 14 weeks. So if we can go to the next slide. So this is my plan. We're going to have animals under 6 months of age. We're going to have on cake and straw and mature hay. Let's get that kind of 50% skeletal growth, and utilise the fact we've got a feed convergency of 3 to 4 kilos dry matter in to get a kilo of growth. If I'm honest, I probably wouldn't swap it. I like the KISS principle in life of keep it simple, stupid. So cake and straw works really well and it's easy. So that's my personal preference. However, I completely appreciate that doesn't suit everyone. So at this point, we can look at doing a TMR. Whether it's recycling or custom made, we need to be careful and we need to ration it. I can appreciate the advantages of we can utilise cheaper straights and blends, and we can decrease those feed costs, which are so high, especially at the moment. But don't forget, it does add other costs in, like your labour, your diesel, your mixer wagon depreciation. You know, the time to remix it and relay it out. It is going to depend on your farm. But my one thing would be is make sure you have rationed it for the right energy and protein. Sorry, can we move to the next slide, please? Whilst this isn't strictly weaning, just on a note of transitioning to a TMR, please try and do it gradually. One of the things to think about is that transit time from eating the feed till it's completely out of the room is 35 to 48 hours, depending on how much forage you've got in there compared to concentrate and the daily dry matter intake. So do it gradually and wait 3 or 4 days to check what the faeces are doing. If the faeces have gone loose, it means we're drawing water into the GI tract because we've got products of fermentation in the lumen of the intestine, which is not what we want, and that means you've changed the diet too quick. Again, potential for performance checks and obviously stresses. So if we can move to the next slide, please. And then lastly, when we think about feeding post-weaning, please don't forget about presentation. You know, feed space per heifer is so important, especially if we're not ad-lib feeding concentrate. These are social creatures, they like to do everything together. We need to check that they can all eat together. The other thing is make sure they can reach. This picture is from a unit years ago. I got asked to go and see why their post-weaning heifers weren't growing well. We effectively put a giant motorway barrier in front of them being able to eat the feed. Check your neck rail height. You can see the neck calluses here. And the other thing to think about is water, especially around weaning. They're going to start to drink a lot more water. Make sure that 10% of the group can drink at all times, and it needs to be clean. So dunk a glass of water in and think, would I drink it? And remember that it's really important because we're feeding a very dry diet. So it's a bit like me giving you a box of cheese crackers and challenging you to eat it as quickly as possible without anything to drink. You're not going to get very far. And the last thing is to think about chop length. Ideally, we want to chop the straw. You can increase that chop length gradually over time, but you're normally looking for less than 5 centimetres. Why is this important? Well, we do want them to intake some straw. And I always think of it as if I did you a hands-free eating challenge and challenged you to eat spaghetti or penne pasta. Which one would you eat the quickest? It's going to be the penne. It's the same with calves. Also, if it's been chopped really short, it acts really nicely as a toothpick on those papillae to get rid of those purple keratin cells that we discussed earlier with the parakeratosis. And I think we've now got a question slide, if memory serves me right.
Yeah, thank you. We had a question on chopped straw or whole straw, so I think we've covered that. The other one was about, I guess, just a quick summary answer again. What's your view on offering silage as calves, or when age would you offer it?
So for me, 6 months of age, you know, we're not going to get a lot of energy out of it, and calves aren't going to eat as much of it. So for me, it really is, let's get really nice growth. Let's keep them on the diet that they're used to of concentrate and straw, and then at 6 months of age, when the rumen is ready to utilise it, then we'll gradually add it in. And it needs to be gradual because they're also going to have to change the microbiome that they've got in their gut to be able to utilise it.
Right, thank you. And does straw type matter, wheat, barley or oat?
Again, I'm not really fussed, to be honest. It's not there for energy, so it's there for that rumen development.
Okay, thank you. And then this was going back a little bit, but is automated feeding better if you want to only feed 6 litres and get them to eat concentrate?
I think it depends. I mean, for me, I always think of quite a lot of it comes down to presentation, stockmanship. You know, I've got farms where automated feeders work brilliantly, somewhere they don't work quite as well. I've got people who manually feed twice a day and it works fantastically. I think it's what are you trying to achieve out of it? But for starter intake, the method of feeding, from what I've seen, doesn't intake it, and I can't think of any research off the top of my head that says otherwise. But I don't mind having a look, and if I find something, we can send it around to the people attending after.
Great, thank you. Oh, someone's asked, what about feeding red clover silage? I guess answer that as if it was after 6 months.
Yeah, again, for me, it's the after 6 months, and then it's yeah, checking your protein and balancing energy and making sure that how much you're feeding matches their energy intakes. If I'm honest, I don't have a huge amount of experience of feeding it to heifers, but from a rumen development point of view, I'd wait till after 6 months.
Great, thank you. There was a couple of questions on grazing, but I think we're going to cover that now.
Yeah, on to grazing. Okay, so I am just going to say now I'm not a grazing expert by a long shot, but I have worked with a lot of grazing herds with heifers, and these are my kind of key considerations when you turn out to grass. There's somebody mentioned it in a question earlier, but there's definitely a myth I want to dispel of we do not need to teach our baby heifers how to be grazing cattle when they're young. If they don't graze in that first season, it doesn't mean they will not be efficient milking grazing cattle. And there is actually research to prove this. One of the big things that does actually help with becoming an efficient grazer is having an experienced companion. But just because you're a grazing herd does not mean that as soon as we wean these calves, especially if you're spring block and it's horrible, cold, miserable, wet weather, we do not have to chuck them out at grass. It may not be beneficial in the long run. So we can graze heifers, we definitely can, but it does require quite a lot of input, and we need to treat them like they're the most important animals on their farm, which in my mind they are. This is your future herd in 18 months, 2 years time. So we're not just going to chuck them in a field and leave them alone. That's not going to work. So these are my considerations. Young stock are really inefficient grazers. We're less than 30%, less than 60% of what you'd expect an adult cow to achieve. So if you're trying to get low residuals off a paddock, you're going to get that at the expense of dry matter intake, and you're not going to get your daily live weight gains. So when we think about that, what should we be offering young stock? Well, we want high quality leafy grass swards throughout the grazing system, and ideally at that 2-leaf stage. Quite often for this to happen, especially if you have a young stock platform, you may well need to top and to remove that dead stemmy material that they're not going to eat, especially as we get later on into the season, because we want to get those high grass intakes. So when we top, you're looking at about 5 to 6 centimetres, and you're going to want to do that immediately after the heifers are removed, otherwise you tend to get a check in that grass regrowth. So when you're talking about what pre-grazing grass covers you want, you're looking at normally around 2,500 to 3,000 kilograms of dry matter per hectare, or somewhere between 7 to 9, 7 to 10 centimetres of sward height. A system that often works quite well is the leader-follower system, where young stock have the access first. Let them basically, they're the picky eaters, aren't they? They're the picky eaters that as children nobody wants to invite to a party. Let them pick what they want to have first, let them take the best bits, and then bring in the low milkers, bring in your pregnant heifers, the ones that are much better and are more efficient. Another thing to think about is today is a great example of sheltered areas, whether it's from bad weather or hot weather. We need to make sure that they have these areas, that we've also got adequate water trough space and things like that, because these guys are not as robust as our older animals. So if we go on to the next slide, please, Emily. If we look at the dry matter intake required, so this table's from Dairy NZ, and you can see that we're looking for 150 kilo in that top table. The difference between for 0.4 kilos of growth a day, you're looking for 3 kilos of dry matter. For 0.8, you've nearly added on an extra kilo. So it's quite a big difference. And also these guys are saying that we should be aiming for 2.4% body weight, which actually for a 150 kilo animal, we're over that at 3.9 kilos of dry matter intake. So we need to be kind of careful as to, are we pushing that? If you look at the bottom little bit in pink, these are the recommendations from AHDB and CAFRA, which are over in Ireland. And these guys are recommending a higher dry matter intake of about 3% body weight, so 4.5 kilos for those 3 to 4 month old calves. So for me, it really shows that actually we've got quite a lot of variation and we're still not even sure exactly how much we should be aiming for and what intakes we're going to get. And a lot of it is going to depend on what the grass is that we put in front of them. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So purely from the point of view of our grazing heifers, what have we got? So if you look here, this is, I've worked out the energy requirements for 150 kilo heifer, 0.8 kilos a day growth and 1.2. I've also gone onto the AHDB grass, and you can see kind of the dry matter content. I think this was done a couple of weeks ago at 30, just over 30%, and the energy is 11.5. So actually, if we're going off the dairy NZ 2.4%, we should be able to theoretically get 0.8. We're going to push it quite a lot to get 1.2. If we go on to the next slide, sorry, oh yeah, you can now start to see that actually if you look over on the left, if you look at the grass ME content, so this is of the reported, we've got quite a variation in what's reported. So the minimum was 9.7 and the maximum was 12.6. So actually for 0.8 kilos a day, we've got kind of quite a variation, and actually we are going to struggle. You know, we're getting, if we're at 9.7, we really are at the top end of how much they're going to eat. And that's with them being in perfect conditions, no parasitic burden, no trace mineral issues, no weather issues, fresh pasture in front of them all the time. So it's going to have to be tip-top conditions for us to be able to get 0.8 kilos a day growth. If we go to the next slide, please. Similarly, so it's actually to say 1.2 kilos a day at the top. You can start to see that actually we are really pushing it once we get to wanting 1.2 kilos a day growth. You know, even on the top 12.6, we're just below the dairy NZ recommendation of 2.4. If we're down at 9.7, we are at the AHDB recommendation of 3%. But again, it's going to have to be really well managed grass for us to get that. So if we go a step ahead again, please. Next slide. Yeah, there we go. Sorry. Yeah. So actually, I suppose for me, I then think of, okay, what I like less about grazing is it varies on me, and it can vary quite quickly on me. And this is data taken in 2019 from 50 farms across the UK that were doing grass measurements. I've put a line at 11.5, which is kind of the minimum of where I'd want grass to be for grazing heifers. And you can see that average line, it dances around it. And we do have significant time periods over the season where we're below. The thing that stresses me more out is the spread, that variation, which is the grey. You can see we're often varying by kind of 2 megajoules of energy per kilo dry matter. That's a lot of variation in what's offered. And, you know, that's only sampling one paddock on one farm. So how much variation have we got across our farms? And are we willing to say, yes, we want these heifers to learn to graze and then be able to get their growth off this? And that is going to vary between farms as to how happy you are with where your grass is, and also throughout the season. So if we skip to the next slide, my other thought is, I'm not saying don't turn them out, but don't forget there might be times where actually a bit of supplementary feeding can always help. And you're only going to really know this by either having some fantastic grass reports, or by doing your growth rates. And if they're not growing how you want them to grow, either the grass or the heifers, knowing that you're going to have to chuck some concentrate in as well. And again, you can just see that addition of 1 kilo of concentrate puts us comfortably below that 2% requirement for the of intake. So again, it's being smart with it, and actually if we get them to grow well here as first season grazing heifers, does it mean that they don't have to grow as well later on? So if we click on to the next slide. So just going back to this slide, the last thing I wanted to have a quick chat to you about was about grazing is limited paddock rotation. So sorry, if we click onto the next one, I think it'll flash a funky colour first. I was trying to look clever. So this is data from an AHDB study, and they were putting them in at 2,500 and bringing them out at 1,600. And they used heifers that were between 3 to 7 months of age, and they were either on a continuous grazing system, which is the green set stocked, and these guys grew at 0.64 kilos a day, or they rotated them and made either a 3-day paddock rotation, the blue, or a 6-day paddock rotation. You can see that the 3-day paddock rotation, they grew about 40 grams a day more, but actually, if they're on a 6-day rotation, they grew 160 grams a day more, and they didn't have any concentrate supplementation here. So again, we haven't met our target growth rates. We're still only just at about 0.8 if you do really good paddock rotation, but that paddock rotation is really important. And we often talk about paddocks being calf sick. That's because they've chosen the nice bits of grass. They're only left with the rubbishy bits. We also have had calves on it since like the arc, and therefore we've got a high parasite worm burden. Quite a lot of the gut worms and cocci have a great ability to overwinter on pasture. So they just build up and build up and build up. And also, again, we don't know whether there's any trace element deficiencies and stuff, and so testing in those paddocks. If we are grazing the same area, it's nice to kind of do the leader follower, so put the young animals out on that paddock first, and then bring the next older set of animals through. And that also minimises the risk of the younger ones picking up any parasites from the older ones as well. So I think that was my quick whiz through grazing.
Thank you. I'll just share with you the poll that we did earlier on rotating paddocks. So that was the responses, yeah.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to know now how many people are keen to rotate, or if they're not going to rotate, add concentrate in.
Yeah. So yeah, that was one of the questions. Should you still feed concentrates at grass?
So for me, it's all about knowing what your grass is doing and also knowing what your heifers are doing. So checking those growth rates and checking the grass. I do agree with grazing farmers who tell me that if they look after the grass, they don't have to worry about the cows. It's similar with the heifers, but they do have to be treated as kind of the top tier and be given the best, or else you are going to struggle. If you can't do that, then there is nothing wrong with supplementing concentrates. And I'll show you that in the last few slides that I've got coming up.
All right. Thank you. Another question, can Springborne calves be run in grass paddocks?
Yeah, again, I have no worries about this. The one thing I would say is that still offer them some access to forage, so some chopped straw and some concentrate, and just also make sure that they've got some form of shelter. Like I had a guy that spring block calves grew beautifully, saying it was January, February time, pre-weaned, made the delightful decision to turn them out on a paddock, and it was the April where all it did was rain, and they couldn't get any new seed in, so the calves had to stay there for ages. There wasn't a huge amount of shelter, and we had a massive weaning check. They weren't ready for that kind of brutal environment yet. They are still babies at the end of the day, and there's quite a lot of stress and change around weaning. So I don't have any problems with it. Just make sure you offer them somewhere to get out of the weather, and you still offer them a diet that's going to give them some energy. Oh, and don't forget about your parasite burdens if they're staying in that one paddock as well.
Yeah, so that was just, I wondered if you could do a little bit of a clarification on talking about rotational or set stocking, like the difference between looking at forage quality and then also parasite burden.
So in terms of parasite burden, if you've got calves that are on a paddock, they'll pick up a few parasites to start with at the start of the season, and they basically act as a multiplier. And especially if you are then adding younger calves in to that mob constantly, they then multiply them up and they're more likely to cause disease in younger calves, but they can multiply them up to the point that they can cause subclinical disease, so decreased growth rates, or clinical disease scours in older animals. You often tend to find that how well you get away with that, for want of a better word, is going to depend on you whether, you know, typical coxswain outbreak is you'll get a phone call to say my calves are scouring, and actually if you think of the weather in the last week, it's been wet and windy and they've all gone and sat under that tree over there all together, huddling together, defecating in the same area, and the coxswain's just gone ballistic and gone all the way through them. So what was the other, have I answered that question?
Yeah, and I then just comparing, so the benefits of rotational are both for parasite burden and growth quality.
So rotational, you're gonna ease the kind of growth, so you've got the ability to give the grass a bit of a rest, and you can also get that growth similar to how you would do on a grazing platform for milking cows. And the other thing is also, if you're going to be doing rotational, you're going to have less of a build-up of feces for parasites, which is where all the parasites are over time, basically.
Right, thank you. And then last one, any research on herbal leys for heifers? Have you heard of any or had experience?
Not that I know of or that I've read. If I say, like I say, I'm not a massive grazing expert. I'm sure there probably is some because it's something that people are really getting into. But no, I'm afraid I'm gonna not be able to answer that question very well. Sorry.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll move on. We might run over a little bit.
Sorry, that's my technical issues. So I suppose for me, it's how well do we know it's gone? So sorry, if we move on to the next slide. Yeah, so it's all about data. Oh. And basically you've got to measure it to know. Granted, this is a small number of calves, this wouldn't be enough for me to take any measurements off, but you can start to see that actually from this data that we're starting to get around post-weaning, they don't do as well, and it takes them a few weeks to recover before they start to do well. How are we going to get this data? So if we go on to the next slide, gold standard is calibrated electronic scales. They're ACE. You know, you can get some really nice ones, and there's usually some grants flying around to get them. My one thing with those is if you've got them, please calibrate them each time you use them. Act as a sense check. Also, try and use something that has a stable weight. We had a farm that used to weigh a certain member of staff, which was great until he went on a diet and started to lose weight. So a dumbbell or a weight of some description might have been better. The other one that people always think about are the heart girth tapes, so the ones that we wrap around kind of where the heart goes, just under the elbow. And we've always wondered about how accurate they are. So this is research that we did looking at that. And actually we found that in terms of body weight, you tended to be kind of 2 or 3 kilos out with actual body weights, which is great if we're thinking about worming or medication, because we're going to still be accurate enough. But actually, would they be accurate enough for daily live weight gain? Well, we actually found, providing it is the same person, you can be. But it's also based on the timings between the weighing. And the caveat of this is it's a group level tool. We're not looking at the individual. So for that, we need to measure a number of calves. How many we need to measure depends on the timing between the two measurements and how accurate you want it to be. So basically, Bobby, who I work with, did some very clever maths. And so if you click and the box should come up. And if you look here, he's worked out the average number of calves required to work out an accurate within 50 grams per day how many calves you need. So actually, if you're going for between 2 weeks, you need 67. You know, that's a lot. But actually, if we're aiming for 4 weeks, so 28, 18 calves to make you feel comfortable around your decision making isn't actually that many. And you can see the further apart it goes, the fewer calves you're going to need to be super confident. So for me, it's thinking about when you're going to do it and what's the important time. The one that I like doing personally is around 4 weeks of age, because all of that growth is going to be based on just milk, because even if we've offered starter from birth, they're not going to have started utilising it yet. And then up to the point of weaning, how well is that rumen developing? And then kind of after the point of weaning, about 4 weeks after, again, it gives me a reasonable size of calves to work with. And this data doesn't have to be all got on one day. It can be built up over time to have a look at it. And you'll often see seasonal changes. Our calves don't grow as well in winter because they're trying to keep warm. We look at the next slide. The other set of data that's really worth looking at as well is to see how well your weaning's going is, are your animals stressed at weaning? And if we see stressed animals, we often see pneumonia. So this is basically the number of treatments for pneumonia done, and we've done it by age. And I don't know if it's cut it off for you, but it has for me. So the blue is up to 60 days of age, green is 60 to 90, and then it's 90 plus. And actually, what we can see here is in January this year, we had a massive increase in the number of calves that we were treating around the point of weaning. Why did that happen? Something had gone hideously wrong with our robotic feeders, and we actually weaned our calves from a very high plane of nutrition over a very short period of time. We caused a large amount of stress from a large amount of energy loss, and in doing so, our animals were more susceptible to pneumonia, and we had a lot of clinical cases. So don't forget to look at other things apart from daily live weight gain. And if we go on to the next slide, consequences of getting it wrong. So I'd like to just show you this last case study. So if we click onto the next slide, please. So somebody asked earlier about targets. So this is a spring block carver. And actually what we've done is we've looked at our age, we've looked at our feed conversion efficiency, and we've put a target on. And then we've actually looked at, have we hit the target? You know, this measure, monitor, feedback system. We didn't quite get it on the 0 to 2 months, but we were nearly there. We were 0.2 off for post-weaning. Again, less keen on feeding them concentrate, more keen at putting them out grass. We then had a great discussion about how overwintering on fodder beet was going to impact our growth rates, and sure enough, we did. So come, I think it was the February, I got a phone call to say, we've just weighed our calves that are going to be up for service in May, and we're short. What on earth are we going to do? We worked out we needed to get 1.2 kilograms a day. So if we click onto the next slide, please. So we brought them back onto the grazing platform and we supplemented with concentrates. We went for 2 kilograms per head per day. We were not going to get this wrong. 75 heifers, and we did it for 60 days. So we fed 13.5 tons. So we spent just over £4.5 grand, which was £61 a heifer. So if we click onto the next one, please. What could I spend £61 a heifer on? So if you click again, please, that's the equivalent of their milk replacer, which is £2,400 a tonne, of an extra 0.45 kilograms a day of milk replacer. That's an extra nearly 11 megajoules a day, and that's half the energy requirement for a calf to grow at 60 kilo calf, to grow at 0.8 kilos a day. So we could have easily hit the 0.8 and beyond, probably got close to nearly 1 if we'd put that £61 into milk feeding. We could have given them an extra kilo a day of cake, and that's 38% of the requirement for a 120 kilo calf to grow at 0.8 kilos a day. If we wanted them to grow at 1.2, that's a 30% energy requirement. Again, we would have got it really nicely. And over wintering, we could have added some grass silage and some cake. So I suppose for me, it's that lesson learned of this catch-up was really expensive for us, and actually could we have utilised it more efficiently if we were going to spend that money, or actually we didn't have to spend all of that money per heifer earlier on, but we probably would have got some better results. So on my next slide, please. So my challenge to you is, do you know if you're meeting your targets? What are your targets for growth? How is it going, and how is weaning and that rumen development impacting that? If you're not meeting them, where is that happening and why is that not happening? If you are meeting them, that is awesome. But are you doing it in the most economical manner? And are you also still getting the future benefits of really early life growth? So I think that if we go on to the next slide, I think that's then the...
Yeah, I'll just ask you a question on this area. What would you do with calves not hitting target? And I guess more if it's a variable group. So what would kind of a practical option as splitting them could cause stress?
Yeah, so I'm afraid I would split them. Obviously, it depends on your size of group and what facilities you've got. But interestingly, I had a text this morning off one of our spring block calvers who's just sent me her R1 growth rates to have a chat about next week. And she said, before you say it, the ones that haven't achieved, I've already split off. They're in a different paddock and they're getting concentrate. Ideally, we want to treat everything as one cohort and one mob, but you've got to look at it and what's the consequences for you if they're not at the right stage when you want to serve them. What if they're not the right weight at calving? Where are your issues going to be? You know, if you have the luxury of excess heifers, is this where we start to make decisions as to who we keep and who we don't keep? I guess again, it's that cop out, and I feel really bad saying it. It is very farm specific, but actually the fact that you've raised it means you can have, and you've got the data, you can start to have these conversations with either your vet, your nutritionist, any consultant within the farm team as to what do we do with them, how do we manage it. This slide, sorry, I just wanted to quickly say whilst today's not been overly practical, it's been more theoretical. We are going to discuss more practical stuff in the road shows, mostly because I thought it'd be more fun to bounce around on farm looking at practical stuff while we're there. And I think the next slide is the roadshow dates again.
Yeah, so yeah, that was just to say that we've had a question, but we're kind of running out of time now on pros and cons for step down weaning, but I know we're going to cover that in the on-farm meeting. So there's the list again, just to look over, but the ones coming up in the next couple of months are already online. If not, the ones just keep a lookout. But I think we've about finished up now. So kind of
my last slide, because I've got a big ask to say of if anybody, sorry, that's the one after this. If anybody has 5-10 minutes, I am running a survey about how farmers treat calf disease on farm, because I really want to know what you guys are doing. If you have chance to fill it in, that would be great. It's at the nottingham.ac.uk herd health toolkit. And that toolkit also has lots of really cool little calculators to play with. And if there is a weight gain one on there for utilising calf weight data as well. And if you've got any questions at any point, please feel free to get in touch with me via email. I'm also on Instagram and Twitter as well. I'm always more than happy to chat about calves.
Fantastic, thank you, Ginny. Yeah, and if you're around in the Midlands area, then Ginny will be running some of the on-farm road shows, so we can continue the discussion. So thank you very much. I'll try and get this link included in the follow-up email, and along in the follow-up email there'll be a few of these links to tools and resources which are on the AHDB website. We do have some calf weigh tapes as well, so if you haven't got one and would like to try them, start weighing some heifers, then that's a good place to start. So thank you everyone for listening today, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, and sorry.
Yeah, sorry about the technical difficulties earlier on.